and welcome to South2North, coming to you from a South Africa in mourning. This edition of South2North is dedicated to the memory of South Africa's first democratically elected leader, Nelson Mandela. Those who've been in Nelson Mandela's presence can testify that he had a magnetic personality, and today we are feeling this loss profoundly. Madiba lived a deep and meaningful life, a life filled with loss, love, defeat, and outstanding triumph. Film directors from all over the world have captured aspects of his life in their work. Some of them were privileged to have precious moments with him, and we've asked 3 filmmakers to select some of their best footage about Mandela and share this with us today as we celebrate his legacy. I have with me on the show today Angus Gibson, who co-directed an Oscar-nominated film, Mandela, Son of Africa, Father of a Nation. We will also tonight speak to Xoliswa Sithole, a seasoned documentary filmmaker who has won 2 British Academy Awards, a Peabody Award, and an Emmy nomination. And our third guest is Khalo Matabali, who has won awards for drama and documentary films, including Best South African Film. He's making a film at the moment about the impact of Mandela's philosophies on people around the world. But first up, Angus Gibson, welcome to the program.
Hi.
You've made so many award-winning films, but the film on Mandela, was that particularly special?
Of course it was special.
Because he was Madiba?
Because he was Madiba. And my friend Joe Menel, I'd heard, was making the autobiographical documentary. And he had asked me if I could work on it. So the next day, literally, I got on a plane and I flew to the Bahamas, where I spent Christmas and New Year together with Madiba, talking to him each morning, and then spending
You
sort
spent
of the rest.
the festive season with Madiba.
I did. Christmas and New Year.
Did you get to know him during that time?
The thing that struck me at the time was a sense of a very lonely man, actually. He had not connected with Grassa.
His third wife?
Yes. He was apart from Winnie. And I think there was this immense sense of the responsibility of what was coming. And there he was, kind of alone in this very large house on this island with 2 bodyguards. I did not envy him in that moment.
Very often, people wanted to forget that he was a human being. He was this icon, but there was a real human being in there with a heart and moments of doubt, perhaps.
I've no doubt there were moments of doubt. And in fact, I made the film, I think, in many ways, at perfectly the wrong time, because he was about to become president. He had this huge responsibility on his shoulders. And clearly he had to be, I think, first and foremost, he's a great politician. And he had to be very careful about what he said in those interviews. So the interviews were I think they're extraordinary interviews, but they are measured and careful. He never puts a foot wrong.
But then your film, I think, went further because it wasn't just about Mandela, the politician, the man who was about to become the president of a democratic South Africa, but we saw aspects of his own personal life, his early years, from his adolescence, the circumcision, his time in law school. Let's take a look at this clip.
It is the custom amongst the Xhosas that when a boy reaches a certain age, he should undergo circumcision. I was 16 years of age when we were taken to the circumcision school. We discarded our clothing and we were instructed to sit on new blankets with our legs open. And I heard the first boy saying, "Ndindoda, I am a man." And I must confess that the pain paralyzed me momentarily, and I was not as forthright and strong as the other boys that preceded me.
For me, that clip has a lot to do with, I mean, one of Madiba's great charms is his sort of self-deprecating kind of nature. You know, I watched many, many journalists because I spent 3 or 4 months with him, talking to him, and I felt like each journalist would come in the hope of finding that nugget, that story that nobody else knew. But the truth is that Madiba had a repertoire of stories, and it was, let's say it was 20 stories. And he never strayed from those 20, and this was one of them.
Okay, there's another story about
Yeah.
his name, Rolihlahla.
Yeah.
Let's see how Madiba became Nelson.
He was of royal blood, a descendant of Tembu chiefs, part of the Xhosa nation. He was called Rolihlahla Madiba Dalibunga Mandela.
When I went to school, the lady teacher, Miss Mdingane, asked, "What is your name?" I told him my African name, Rolihlahla. He says, "No, I don't want that one. You must have a Christian name." So I say, "No, I don't have one." She says, from today, you are going to be Nelson. That's how I earned the name Nelson. Not given by my parents. In fact, my mother, who has never gone to school, took me one day to a doctor. And the doctor asked, "Now, what is his name?" She said, Nelisile. His name is Nelisile. Because it was a white name, you see, and they couldn't pronounce it properly.
And Nelisile is a girl's name, by the way. So he came to love his name, though. But I can see there he's amused and he's smiling and he's laughing at himself as well.
He has a great sense of humor.
Let's for a moment then talk about Mandela in love, Mandela in relationships. By the time he met Winnie, of course, he'd had a wife, Evelyn, his first wife, but Winnie Madikizela Mandela is perhaps the most famous of Mandela's wives because she is a politician in her own right, known as the mother of the nation, a very controversial figure. I wonder what she has to say about their first date. Let's have a look.
I tried to avoid the meeting, and he is, of course, very persistent, and he has the type of voice you can't say no to. When he asks you for a favor, he is in fact giving you a command in a very polite way. So he was giving me this command to meet him, and the trembling little girl, of course, I said yes.
There are so many layers to Winnie's comment, and the first one I can think of is what you said earlier, that there was a politician there, a man with a strong resolve, but here he was in love. What did he have to say about being in love?
Well, it was a moment where he didn't want to talk about being in love, is the truth of it, because the relationship had broken down. And I think he was very incredibly sad about it. And he hadn't found the relationship with Graça. It was extraordinary being in the office around Madiba. And, you know, I would go to the reception room and there'd be these young firebrands sitting out there and they'd say, you know, we're going to confront the old man. And we're going to go in there, and I would hear them talking about what they're going to confront him on this and that. And they would walk into his office and they would sit down and they would be puppies. All of that fight went out of them because he had quite an extraordinary authority. And I think that is one of the most, it was kind of our gift in a way. The fact that South Africa got that authority from him to sort of steer a path through that very difficult time. And
that path culminated in the inauguration on the 10th of May, 1994. In fact, I remember where I was. I was a 16-year-old girl at boarding school in a very conservative part of South Africa in the northwest that resisted the transformation. And I remember watching this inauguration and listening to Mandela's speech and making a commitment to be a good citizen. But I understand that Nelson Mandela had a mini crisis just before the inauguration, and it all centered around a bow tie. Let's see.
The Chief Justice will then announce the results. Nelson Mandela, State President.
I think the best thing is to say.
So we just invite them to the ceremony, and you invite them later at the fine.
Yeah.
There are 120 heads of state coming now. And there is no
120.
way, 120.
Yo.
There is no way, Tata, that you're going to be able to accord them all the respect you should in the short time we have.
I see.
Now, some will get 10 minutes, some will get 5 minutes, some will get a handshake.
The dress in the evening. What is the dress? What do we decide, by the way?
You must, well, it's acceptable for you to wear, and it's not acceptable for you not to wear a bow tie, a black bow tie.
I would like something which indicates that we are not far from the lifestyle of our people.
A bow tie in the evening is formal but festive.
And you look so handsome in it. We've worn it in Washington, you've worn it at the Carlton.
Nothing bow tie, man. It's not something that I would feel most uncomfortable. Every time I put on that thing, I can't even talk. I find it difficult to talk. And, I would prefer just a suit.
Okay.
But it must be a dignified suit and so on.
No.
I can't believe the serious look on his face. He took this bow tie issue quite seriously.
It's my favorite part of the film, and I sort of felt like I was witnessing history sort of in the making. Because from that moment, he never again wore a bow tie. You know, he went to meet the Queen or whoever wearing the clothes that he chose to wear. In a sense, it felt like a kind of African triumph for me.
That was such a special moment. Yeah. We are much obliged and indebted to you, Angus. Thank you. Well, our next guest also has stories to share about Nelson Mandela. Xoliswa Sithole was born in South Africa and raised in Zimbabwe. She began as an actress in the anti-apartheid films Cry Freedom and Mandela. She later moved behind the camera as a director and producer. In 2009, she produced the documentary Project Mandela. The gripping political thriller looks at the 13-year period from 1977 to 1990 and how the apartheid government agonized over the release of Nelson Mandela.
It is absolutely necessary at times for the leader to take an independent action without consulting anybody.
There was no hard labor in the lime quarry that day. Instead, the prisoners were ordered to pretend they were busy gardening. Mandela was soon recognized amongst them, but publishing his image or quoting him was forbidden, and not a single frame of this film made it to the world outside.
Xoliswa, share with us some of the memorable moments of putting that film together.
You know, it was very interesting for us to think of a way of doing a film that had never been done, because so many films have been done on, Nelson Mandela. And it was interesting to just look at a certain part of his life, certain point in time in history, where he made a decision which was very unconstitutional within the ANC, because everything within the ANC was, you had to negotiate, you had to talk about it. This particular instance, he basically made the decision to start negotiations with the Afrikaners. And some of the people in the ANC thought that he had sold out. But he does say that actually at a certain point in time, as a leader, you need to make that decision.
So, Xoliswa, what were some of the most memorable moments in putting this film together?
It was about making a film about Mandela, but Mandela not being there, but making it very personal. Listening to his life, because it was hours and hours of interviews that have never been made available. That was absolutely, fascinating for us. And also going to the archives, because the Afrikaners had a file called Project Mandela on how they were going to deal with this person.
In fact, I understand they even assigned a psychologist to him as well. Yeah?
And finding out things like when Mandela was sick, Germany phoning the Afrikaners saying that if this man dies, you are in trouble.
I didn't know that.
Mandela was actually more important in sickness at that time. And them actually trying now to think, okay, this man can't die.
We need to keep Mandela alive.
We need to make sure.
Irony of it.
Do you know what I'm trying to say? And so finding out some of those things that are actually not in the public domain, for me, was absolutely astounding.
There's something very unique about the film, and that is you go and speak to the spies. It's very difficult to get an interview with a spy, never mind a few. What did they say about the man? What did they say about Mandela?
In spite of the fact that they were working for the nationalist government and they were there to promote apartheid, all of them, they say that he was a decent human being. Mm-hmm. For me, that's what Mandela represents to me. He has the ability to see the God in everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's just a quality that certain people have.
The prisoners were secretly monitored with hidden microphones to track subversion and to search for any psychological vulnerability that could be exploited. They were anxious to understand Mandela's mind. The Minister of Justice called for a profile from the former police psychologist. In his report, Dr. Roux concluded that Mandela betrays no visible sign of bitterness towards whites, although this could be a bluff. He is manipulative. He has an unflinching and stubborn belief in his cause.
Xoliswa, you have a story yourself. You're not just a director. You know, I've watched this film, Mandela, so many times, and it is based on the life of Nelson Mandela. I didn't know that you were little Zinzi Mandela, Mandela's daughter from Winnie Madikizela Mandela, reading a letter from Daddy while he was in prison. I feel a particular attachment to that particular story because Zinzi gave that speech at the Orlando Stadium, which was not far from where I grew up. You are little Zinzi in the film.
Yes, that was about, I think, 28 years ago in Zimbabwe, and it was a film that HBO was doing. Danny Glover was acting as Mandela and Alfred Woodard as Winnie. I remember the speech, "My father speaks not only for himself, but for his comrades at Paulsbo prison. Let Botha renounce violence." Da-da-da-da. But yeah, and it's 28 years ago.
Amanda! Elizabeth!
It's time to bring in our next filmmaker. My next guest is Khalo Matabane. Matabane spent his childhood in rural Limpopo, South Africa. He's made several documentaries, TV and feature films that have earned him many awards, including Best South African Film. Matabane's latest documentary project, A Letter to Nelson Mandela, interrogates the memory of Nelson Mandela, using interviews with leading public intellectuals, including Nobel Peace Prize author Wole Soyinka, the Dalai Lama, and South African human rights lawyer George Bizos. Khalo. Welcome. That's a very interesting title for a documentary, A Letter to Nelson Mandela. Tell me about it.
The idea is very simple. Whenever I traveled, people used to say to me that only if we had Nelson Mandela in our countries, our lives would be different. And I thought this is interesting to have a figure that inspires people across the globe, but not only inspires one particular kind of people. Like in the same room, you can have Fidel Castro with Bill Clinton, with Yasser Arafat. You know, it's incredible. And I wanted to understand what is it about this figure that somehow everyone gravitates towards him.
You speak about the theme of reconciliation, and that's what you're dealing with in your documentary. And even here in South Africa, the inequality that we're seeing, the poverty that we're seeing, there are people who blamed Nelson Mandela while he was still alive that he reconciled way too much. So that came across in the film.
Yes, and I mean, one of the things was coming across a squatter camp called Nelson Mandela Squatter Camp, you know, and I filmed that because I was quite interested in this whole idea of what do you do when they name a shanty town after you. As tragic as Nelson Mandela's death is, it would actually liberate the country in terms of discussing critical issues that they never discussed.
Well, I think he has been largely a positive force in the world. And now as we talk about him, I'm saddened by these high expectations. And I wonder, was it fair for all of humanity to have these high expectations of one man? He was always bound to fail.
Well, I think that we need to see Mandela in context. I think that at the point in time in the history of this country, it was very important for us black people especially, where black men have been vilified. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? From the moment a black child is born, we are no good. So there is someone who has the humanity to say that, you know, we can work this out. My problem with Nelson Mandela was the commodification of Nelson Mandela. As a filmmaker, I cannot get the same rates of his footage like any other because Nelson Mandela is platinum. So anything that I want to use as a filmmaker, even if I don't have a lot of money, I simply can't afford it.
You have to pay a fortune.
And Mandela belongs to the people.
Angus, what do you think about this, the expectations on Mandela and how he lived up or measured up to that?
In my view, it felt like a heavy weight. And I also, I think of my family, who I think would probably have vilified Nelson Mandela until not so long ago, when there was the vote about who was the greatest man of the 20th century. They all were absolutely clear that it was Nelson Mandela. And that, I thought, not Churchill, Nelson Mandela. I thought, well, that's incredible, actually.
Yeah. Now, Carla, we're wrapping up the discussion, but I'm looking forward to seeing your documentary because I think it's hard and it's going to maul our emotions. But your own personal feeling of what Nelson Mandela was to the world, to humanity.
He was there as the hero, as the symbol of possibility. For me as a filmmaker, making this, I'm making it because I'm conflicted, and I'm making it because I'm trying to get to the central point of who is this man?
You have humanized him for a lot of people. But your memories of meeting Nelson Mandela?
I met him, and it was when Thabo Mbeki, it was 98, and he was voting in Houghton. At some point in time, our eyes locked. And he said to me, "Young lady, are you married?" And I said, "No." And I said, "No, I'm not married, I'm single." "Well, in my time, you would have been married by now. These young men are very foolish for a beautiful woman like you not to be married." Because, he liked flirting, and that's known, you know what I mean? But I was also working on another project where his humility came across, where he would greet the sound person, he would greet the driver, he would greet everybody. Mm-hmm. And a lot of famous people don't do that.
When I interviewed the Minister of Exterior, which is Foreign Affairs in India, he said, Madiba came to dinner at someone's house, whatever, and there were all these important people sitting and everything else. And he went to the kitchen and he started talking to the staff, So I think in it, but to place all history, all memory, all expectations on one person, I don't think that's fair. I don't think, more importantly, it's not only unfair on him, but it's unfair on ourselves and our own responsibilities of what we can possibly do as human beings.
And I think also it kind of absolves us of our responsibilities to humanity because we've lived knowing that we have this Mandela and that makes us a great nation. So perhaps now it's time to own up to our own weaknesses, our own potential, and do our bit to touch humanity. Not in the same way as Mandela, but in our own different ways. Perhaps that's the lesson that should come out of that. I must thank you for documenting Mandela's life because I think for posterity, for generations to come, for ourselves as well, we'll forever be reminded of the greatness and the magnitude of the man, but most importantly, the lessons from history that should be learned from all your films, from his life, so that we make good decisions about our lives and about our country. Angus, thank you for joining us today. Xoliswa, a pleasure to have you here. Little Zinzi. And Carla, good luck with the film. I really look forward to watching it. Thanks indeed. Thanks to my guests for sharing their insights on this iconic figure who will be revered and remembered for years to come. I want to leave you with something that touched me deeply. It's a clip from the end of Angus Gibson's film.
Death is something inevitable. When a man has done what he conceived to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. I believe I've made that effort. And that is therefore why I will sleep for the eternity.